afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on patient-focused drug development, how RDCA-DAP can help. This webinar is part of NORD's free series of educational webinars for patients and caregivers. My name is Amelia Robert, NORD's Research Project Manager. It is my pleasure to be the moderator for today's event. RDCA-DAP is a platform supported by NORD, Critical Path Institute, and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, that aims to accelerate development of effective drugs for rare disorders. Today, we will be premiering 2 videos about patient-focused drug development and how RDCA-DAP can support these efforts. The videos will be followed by a panel discussion to further expand upon these topics. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce the panelists. First, we have Anne Ruggieri. Anne is the co-founder and vice president of Krabbe Connect and the CEO and founder of Partners for Krabbe Research. Anne participated as patient advocate and caregiver in the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting for Krabbe disease. Next, we have Dr. Michelle Campbell. Dr. Michelle Campbell leads stakeholder engagement and clinical outcomes in the Office of Neuroscience, Office of New Drugs, or OND, in FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Previously, Dr. Campbell was a reviewer on the Clinical Outcome Assessments, or COA, staff and scientific coordinator of the COA qualification program in OND. Dr. Campbell's focus is in patient-focused drug development and the use of patient experience data in the regulatory setting. Our last panelist is Dr. Jeff Barrett. Jeff is the Senior Vice President at CPATH and serves as the lead for its Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data and Analytics Platform, or RDCA-DAP initiative. As Senior Vice President, Dr. Barrett guides all operational and scientific activities for RDCA-DAP. These activities include continuing outreach and collaboration with the rare disease community to optimize data usability and availability, as well as transforming such data into actionable knowledge to advance drug development for rare and orphan conditions. And now, I'm thrilled to premiere NORD's videos on patient-focused drug development and RDCA-DAP.
Advancing rare disease research with patient insights and data. What is patient-focused drug development, PFDD? People living with a rare disease have unique and important insights to share with scientists who are developing or evaluating new treatments. However, for many years, the opportunities for those scientists to hear directly from patients were limited. In 2012, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act was passed by Congress. The legislation, which sought to incorporate the patient voice into drug development, established the PFDD initiative at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Since then, FDA has provided guidance and established procedures to implement this initiative. Through in-person meetings and teleconferences known as listening sessions, patients and caregivers have been able to share their experiences directly with FDA staff. PFDD provides a systematic approach through which patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities can be gathered and meaningfully incorporated into drug development and evaluation. This helps to ensure that the ultimate experts on a disease, those living with it, are heard. This is particularly meaningful for people with rare diseases, since many rare diseases are not well understood, and only about 10% have approved treatments. One resource that can support the collection of patient input is the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data and Analytics Platform, or RDCA-DAP, which makes it possible for data from many sources to be combined on a standardized platform so that it can describe a more complete picture of the disease. In this way, data can be analyzed and used for modeling purposes to develop better trials, ultimately leading to a more efficient drug development process that accelerates the development of therapies. This includes de-identified data from patient organizations, patient registries, and other sources, such as clinical trials and electronic health records, that captures vital information that might not have been available to researchers and regulators in the past. RDCA-DAP is a partnership between Critical Path Institute, CPATH, and NORD. It is funded by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, by supporting efforts to better understand the patient experience and how a disease evolves over time, and providing resources to help patient organizations collect and share their data in scientifically valid ways. CPATH and NORD are working to ensure that researchers and regulators can access de-identified patient data in a centralized database, bring data together from multiple sources to inform a more in-depth understanding of the disease, provide the tools to shape the design of clinical trials so they can be run more efficiently, making it easier for patients to participate, and help make rare disease research and drug development more collaborative, patient-focused, and patient-friendly. You can learn more about this initiative in our next video. How will RDCA-DAP support PFDD? Advancing rare disease research with patient insights and data. How will RDCA-DAP support patient-focused drug development? People with rare diseases often ask, how can I help develop a therapy for my disease? Today, hearing directly from patients and caregivers is more highly valued than it had been in the past. There are new opportunities to advance medical research with patient insights and patient-generated data. There are also new tools and resources available to help patient organizations collect data in ways that are scientifically valid and meaningful, such as through patient registries. When patients are empowered to be partners in the collection and sharing of data, they can help drive research that might have life-changing or even life-saving implications for themselves or others. One tool developed to encourage collaboration and bring together different sources of rare disease data is the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data and Analytics Platform, or RDCA-DAP. Developed by Critical Path Institute, CPATH, and the National Organization for Rare Disorders, NORD, with funding from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, this initiative is supporting the centralization of rare disease data and providing analytic tools that have the potential to advance and accelerate research and drug development for rare diseases. RDCA-DAP seeks to promote better understanding of rare diseases, their impact on patients' lives, and how they develop and progress over time. This can help researchers design clinical trials that are more efficient, less costly, better aligned with patient needs, and more likely to have successful outcomes. By providing a central database and analytics hub, RDCA-DAP can maximize the value and impact of patient data by encouraging data sharing and analysis by multiple researchers. In the past, patient data collected for specific research studies were often used for only a single study. RDCA-DAP can house multiple data sets on the same disease, giving researchers access to more information on the disease they are studying. Research and drug development that is patient-focused can drive new insights, inform the design of clinical trials, and result in more meaningful treatment outcomes for the communities that need them most. RDCA-DAP is an example of an initiative that directly incorporates information from patients, drives collaborative scientific approaches, and also reshapes the pathway to faster treatments.
Excellent. So I saw a question come through during the videos regarding whether or not the videos will be available after our webinar. They will be on NORD's social media and our website. Now I'll turn it over to each panelist to share their thoughts on the videos and provide some brief introductory remarks about patient-focused drug development, or RDCA-DAP. Anne, we'll start with you.
In addition to my roles at Krabbe Connect and Partners for Krabbe Research, I am also the parent of 3 children, 2 of which who were diagnosed with Krabbe disease, Nick and Gina. Nick was born in 1986 and passed in 1987 at just a year old. Gina was born in 1999 and was treated for Krabbe disease at just 3 weeks of age. She lived to be 15 years old. I was able to participate in the patient-focused drug development meeting to share my Krabbe journey with the FDA. Let me tell you a little bit about Krabbe Connect. We are a patient advocacy foundation that is committed to strengthening groundbreaking research by engaging the patients and caregivers with the Krabbe research community to ensure the needs of the Krabbe patients' voices are being heard. Krabbe disease is a rare genetic neurologic condition which affects the central and peripheral nervous systems. The patients are missing an enzyme known as galactose cerebrosidase, or GALC for short, which is critical in myelin formation. Without this enzyme, patients lose their motor function, their ability to eat and swallow, the ability to breathe on their own, and eventually succumb to death. There are several forms of Krabbe disease: early infantile, which is the most common, late infantile, juvenile, and adult. Early detection of Krabbe disease is imperative to treat before symptoms appear. Currently, only 10 states screen for Krabbe disease at birth. Without early detection, the disease progresses, and there are currently no treatment options for symptomatic or progressive diseased individuals. There is a treatment for Krabbe if treated and detected early before too much damage has been done to the nervous system. It is known as a stem cell transplant, which requires chemotherapy to wipe out the immune system. New cells containing the GALC enzyme from an unrelated donor are infused into the patient. This treatment, however, is not a cure, but does slow the progression of the disease and allows the patients to have a better quality of life. This treatment is only available for newborns who have been detected through newborn screening or prior family history, and for some of the late onset juvenile and adult cases that are minimally symptomatic. New treatments are being developed, and in fact, 2 industry partners are currently enrolling patients in gene therapy trials. Gene therapy has the potential to halt the disease process, allowing a longer and better quality of life for Krabbe patients. Krabbe Connect partnered with NORD in late 2019 to engage in a patient-focused drug development meeting, as we knew there was developments of these gene therapies coming to light for Krabbe disease. Our meeting was held in October 2020 virtually. Originally, we planned an in-person meeting with the FDA. However, with COVID restrictions, our meeting became virtual. This actually was to the benefit of our medically fragile patient community, as we were able to have more Krabbe caregivers and patients' voices heard. This platform offered 10 unique Krabbe experiences to be heard by the FDA. Krabbe Connect planned out the initiative and looped in all nonprofit stakeholders involved with Krabbe disease. The meeting was not only impactful to the FDA, but to other involved Krabbe entities, including our industry partners, clinicians, researchers, caregivers, and patients in the disease space. Having this unique opportunity to educate the FDA about the patients and caregivers who have been affected by the disease, along with their unmet needs, helped the FDA to understand the urgency for future drug developments in the disease space. The voice of the patients and caregivers carries a great deal of weight and helps to drive the research by educating the key decision makers. The testimonies that were given were extremely impactful. Several patients shared what it was like to be affected by Krabbe disease, and caregivers were given the opportunity to explain what it was like to manage the care of a patient living with the disease. There was a high concern regarding the there was a high concern amongst the caregivers and patients about the limited amount of treatments and about getting early diagnosis amongst the testimonies. Next slide, Amelia. The full report of the PFDD meeting was published as a 38-page guide to help create awareness. This publication will help to inform all stakeholders about Krabbe disease through the voices of our Krabbe community. The report will also be a key factor for the FDA as they move forward in making decisions for new treatments for Krabbe disease. They will be able to weigh the risks and benefits from the perspective of the actual patients and caregivers who are dealing with or who have dealt with this devastating disease. The FDA is only one stakeholder in the Krabbe disease space. All stakeholders have access to this report, which will help to educate researchers, the biopharmaceutical industry, drug developers, clinicians, and others about the impact of Krabbe disease and the need to advance new treatments quickly. The PFDD meeting is an extremely important opportunity for all rare disease communities. There is power in knowledge, and this meeting is a unique platform in advancing upcoming and promising treatments. Better treatment options equal better quality of life for all Krabbe and rare disease patients. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank Anne for sharing her experience in participating in an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting almost a year ago last year in October of 2020. And I had the opportunity to speak and welcome all stakeholders who came to attend that externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, and what the purpose of these meetings are, and really what do we do as FDA when we listen. And our patient-focused drug development meetings, either ones that the agency hosts themselves or the externally led patient-focused drug development meetings that Anne just spoke about, is really the opportunity for the agency to sit back and listen to the lived experience of patients and caregivers with mostly, we hear most in our rare diseases and disorders. So I want to thank Anne for sharing her experience today and what that was like to go through an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. Next slide, please. So what is patient-focused drug development? It's a term that has fully emerged over the last decade and really brought to the forefront in making sure that we are capturing the patient voice and experiences throughout the drug development pathway and evaluation of a drug. So simply put, patient-focused drug development is really a systematic approach that can ensure that patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into drug development and evaluation. I think that's a really important part. Next slide, please. As we think about the entire concept of the development of new drugs and new therapeutics in general, and while this slide is really more focused in on the drug side, I would probably say that my colleagues from the Center for Biologics and our Center for Devices, this lifespan of medical product development, the input of how a patient and patient communities can contribute throughout that lifespan is equally important. And so how do we really better integrate the patient's perspective into those critical points during that lifespan of drug development and regulatory decision making? And what this slide shows is that this shows examples of where we can capture patient input that can help inform drug development. And so it's not all that patient information and our lived experience that we hear from our patients. It's not all occurring at one time. There are multiple opportunities to help inform drug development. It could happen at the beginning of drug development in those early phases of preclinical studies and trying to go from an idea of maybe this molecule could work And then by that, our patients can help inform our researchers and drug developers on identifying, measuring outcomes and burdens that matter most to patients. When we proceed on to a molecule that may have promise and may be worth actually testing into humans, we can look at our patient communities and inform and have us inform, I should say they can inform our developers on the appropriate designs, thinking about what may be the best opportunity to design a clinical trial, help in recruitment, and how do we retain our study participants, because sometimes these trials may be lengthy, for example. How do we incorporate, again, throughout this life cycle, with capturing that patient voice? Is it through the information of a clinical outcome assessment that can capture the lived experience and see if there is an improvement on how a patient feels, functions, or survives? And how we can integrate that information into our benefit risk assessment when we're reviewing a marketing application. And of course, it's important that no matter after a regulatory decision is made, we need to make sure that we are able to continue to communicate and inform on the approved products to patients and providers so that patients and providers can make the best informed decision for the appropriate treatment of choice. So the patient voice is critical throughout the entire spectrum of drug development, and patients have the opportunity to contribute throughout that lifespan. Next slide. So how does this really tie into when we think about our rare disease drug development? Well, we know in our rare disease drug development, if we take those same concepts of our early phases and preclinical phases in our clinical development, we often have gaps or holes in the critical information that's needed to really inform drug development. For example, do we understand the actual root of a disease in the natural history, in the course and progression? We know that those things are critically important when we want to be able to select optimal outcomes or determine duration of trial. Making sure that we're also getting the patient perspective during this time is important in our rare disease community, and we understand that heterogeneity in our rare diseases can be problematic, and we need to make sure that we've built in methods and ways to handle heterogeneity in our rare disease populations in order to have a successful trial. And then if we are lucky enough in our rare disease community and are able to have a clinical trial, we need to make sure that we have the appropriate study design and protocol and our plan for enrollment. These are just examples, as I said, that where opportunities for patients and their families and the patient communities can contribute and inform along that spectrum and that lifespan of drug development to really improve and really optimize rare disease clinical trial drug development. Next slide. So how does RDCA-DAP really fit into this? What we know and have identified when we come to our rare disease drug development is that we need to have an efficient and comprehensive way to characterize the natural history of a given rare disease, particularly the one that may have a target clinical development program or something in the pipeline. We know that this characterization should be done rigorously with attention to data standards in order to make sure that we're getting the best information and can help inform a quality data that's submitted for regulatory review. We know that a standardized approach that is able to use a natural history study data platform is needed, or a platform that may have advanced analytics that can pull together data sets from various data sources. So not just our clinical trials, but from observational studies, patient registries, all different forms of stakeholders who can contribute data. We would hope that a platform would be able to provide such a disease-neutral background framework, as in it's not necessarily disease-specific, the platform, but really being able to pull the data together and then looking across diseases or maybe families of diseases, depending on the data that's been included. And we know that this information can help us move forward in answering some of those gaps and holes that we may have in our rare disease drug development. And so RDCA-DAP really offers an opportunity to fill in those gaps that we need, not only in rare disease drug development, but also complements the overall efforts of patient-focused drug development by allowing patients to be able to contribute at various time points and spans of the drug development process, their lived experience in different ways and help contribute. So really, RDCA-DAP continues this initiative of patient-focused drug development by looking at incorporating the patient voice and taking the quantitative aspects of the patient voice that may come from trial data or registry data, and really trying to pull it together and to continue to be able to harmonize and unify the patient voice for disease in order that we be able to optimize our clinical trial development and perhaps study protocols for the future. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Jeff Barrett from the Critical Path Institute, to talk a little bit more about RDCA-DAP.
Thanks, Michelle. And I'd like to start by thanking Nord for putting this great webinar series together. I think it's a unique opportunity for us all to come together and be part of this communication with this entire stakeholder community. Next slide. One of the things to point out, and Dr. Campbell did mention this whole notion of patient-focused drug development is still relatively new. What you see on the screen here is really a schematic of what is traditionally referred to as a drug development paradigm, and it kind of highlights the different phases of development. It talks about the stages of development, and it shows the time at which FDA gets engaged and reviews, and then what happens in the post-marketing setting. Now, what I would say is, as Dr. Campbell mentioned, that this has been changed somewhat more recently, and the focus now is on earlier and more rigorous engagement of the patient voice in a much more meaningful way. What you see on this screen is really the absence of the patient voice to any great extent, but it does reflect the historical paradigm that was used for decades, really. And its focus is on the data that drug companies develop themselves and focus on in terms of each stage gate decision that they use to get to the next stage of development. So that's been the historical process. Next slide. Now, if we focus on a more recent approach that is centered on the patient-focused paradigm, you'll see a lot more earlier engagement. And this is something that we all are getting behind in this whole initiative. I provide the reference in this figure as well. What's also important from this reference standpoint is that this is a snapshot of actual use cases coming from the Eli Lilly organization. So this is a place where certain biopharmaceutical companies have taken a stand. They're showing good use cases, and they're clearly showing at all stages of development, even early on, that the patient voice is recognized as critical and is planning for it and is actively seeking that information in order to inform each stage of drug development. So I think the time has come for us to mobilize this. Now, having been a drug developer in the rare disease space in the past, I could tell you that the first effort from anyone engaged in this manner is to inventory and landscape where critical data might be available to understand the patient population, understand the progression of the disease, all the critical features that you heard and describe in detail in terms of the specific rare disease entity. I mean, this is something that every drug developer will have to do from scratch. And in the initial generation of what's called the target product profile, a lot of this information has to be characterized. It has to be defined in the current understanding and then communicated and shared with regulatory authorities. So it behooves the industry to be invested in this area. It's something that everyone is hoping becomes much more part of the habit and not a rare occurrence. And we're planning for this. And this is why the development of the RDCA-DAP platform is a convenient place for one-stop shopping for rare diseases across the board, for all 8,000 rare diseases eventually. But it's a place that not only is a suitcase for this kind of information, but it's a collaborative environment. I don't want you to think that this is only a place where data resides in a passive manner. what we've seen so far, the platform was only recently launched on September 14th, but every stakeholder community, that's academic investigators, biopharmaceutical companies, regulators, patients, patient advocates, have come and gained access to the system. They're providing information. They're engaging in dialogue around a lot of issues that are really shown on this figure. So I would say it's clearly a work in progress, but it is also an invitation to participate in a real and meaningful way. Next slide. So the question you should all be asking yourselves is, how can we contribute to this, and what does it look like in terms of a final product? So what I show you on this slide is, in different pockets of rare disease drug development, there are opportunities where there can be meaningful exchange of information, dialogue around things as the definition of relevant clinical endpoints that would be used to inform clinical trials in specific rare disease communities, a comparison of how these metrics have performed by looking at completed clinical trial data, and then even in the post-marketing sense, have these products performed in the marketplace as expected? And building tools, the COU stands for context of use, where we work in conjunction with biopharmaceutical companies and regulatory authorities to build tools that are specific to certain rare diseases, but also potentially portable across related rare diseases. So there's a great premium on being part of this process, contributing data, but also be part of the dialogue that seeks to accelerate this process and bring cures to patients quicker than later. I think the other thing that I wanted to highlight here is that this is something where it requires a village, as it were, to participate in this. Early reporting back on the performance of this has been fantastic in terms of engaging the community, and by contributing different data types, this has spurred the contribution of other data. So I think we all have the concept of this field of dreams acronym, and it's built so come and be part of the process. And this extends to, obviously, patients, to drug developers, to academic investigators. The platform is not a static place. It's an opportunity to engage in meaningful dialogue and have an opportunity to see each phase of development become accelerated and optimized in a more informative way through the contribution and the participation of the patient voice. With that, I conclude. I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you all for your thoughts. Now I'd love to get started on our panel discussion. So we've had a few questions come through from the audience. First, Michelle, can you give a brief description of patient-focused drug development and how it's included in the drug development process?
Sure. So patient-focused drug development, as Jeff really eloquently said as well, and with one of his slides, is really integrated into drug development, right? And that the opportunity for patients to contribute their lived experience throughout that spectrum and that lifespan of drug development is really the way we are pushing forward in drug development these days. And so we expect almost to want to make sure that patients' voice has been taken into account during a company's development program. Now, again, as I mentioned, there are different modes and opportunities of where that input can come into play, depending on the disease, the disorder, the drug or biologic of study, when is the best time to get that input. But really, patient-focused drug development should almost be the way that we are approaching drug development in general. It should be incorporating that patient voice, and that is really what's been at the forefront for the last decade from the agency, and pushing that is making sure we are taking those opportunities to incorporate the patient voice. And, we will make sure we do look and see, have we talked to patients? Do we have the information? Does this make sense? And so making sure those opportunities have been taken. So I would say at this point, I don't see them anymore as separate concepts, but really the way that drug development should be going forward at this time is really patient focused, and really making sure that we are capturing, and there is a balance, of course, what is important to a patient. And of course, it kind of depends on what is the drug's mechanism of action and what will the drug target and is supposed to do. But ultimately, that we are capturing concepts that are important to patients and that we are measuring clinically meaningful change from the introduction of this treatment, and that if there is a positive change, then it is clinically meaningful to patients, and we therefore see that improvement in how a patient feels or functions and survives.
Thank you, Michelle. Now, Anne, we have a question for you. As a parent and a caregiver and a patient advocate, why was participating in patient-focused drug development important to you? And can you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Yes, thank you, Amelia. This particular meeting was extremely important to me. After losing 2 children to Krabbe disease, one who actually lived with symptoms and one who was treated, we know that the initial treatment is not enough. And knowing that there were other drug development coming down the line, it was an extremely important opportunity for me to represent families like mine who have had previous history of Krabbe disease, losing a child, going through a treatment, and knowing that it's not enough. It was extremely impactful for me to educate the FDA and other stakeholders in my experience so that when these new therapies came along, we knew the urgency to get them passed through, because we do think that these new treatments will be effective for our particular patients in Krabbe disease.
Thank you. Now we have a question for Jeff. This is a big question, but perhaps you can provide a high-level answer. A registrant asked, I'd like to understand the technologies or standards that support the integration and harmonization across data sets, as well as how the system is able to support privacy-related issues. Are you able to speak to those things regarding the RDCA-DAP?
Yes, I think it's always a work in progress from this standpoint. The patient privacy is at the backbone of this entire platform. So I think this is something that we've built into the design construct of this, even in terms of where the data resides, such that it can be used in compliance with all of the data privacy standards. So there is a lot of legislation, and it's different around the world. So we've paid attention to the data privacy legislation that really happens on all parts of the world. This is meant at the very beginning to be a global effort. There's such a paucity of rare disease data in general. We can't make this a US-centric effort, so the focus has to be global. And because of that, we have to adhere to the privacy standards around the world. So in Europe, we have this concept of GDPR, which is a data privacy legislation. This is something that we pay close attention to. It implicates what geographic location we actually store the data in physically. This is a cloud-based environment. And we put forward all of the security measures so that in order to get access, you have to have a legitimate reason, and you have to come from a legitimate person. So there's a lot of checks and balances just to gain access to the system. We also adhere to the fact that all the data is de-identified. That's built into the system as well. And the other thing I saw in the chat was this issue of duplicate data. So this is handled through a process of identifying a global use identifier, or GUID. Again, this concept changes, and we're paying attention to this. We have a standard that's put in place now. It's in compliance with what you see from global regulatory authorities, but we are open to modifying and evolving this as the demand dictates. So these are all very relevant issues, but we pay attention to these. And I would say up on the CPATH website, and is also published on the NORD website, I believe, detailed information of this issue of patient privacy, access to the system, and the compliance with data privacy laws is all captured in detail. We are working on several key publications that describe best practices, both in terms of registry data, as well as the data that populates RDCA-DAP. But it's to everyone's advantage that we are rigorous around this. And the standards piece is not trivial either, because if this was all well-structured data, then we could easily comply with CDISC standards and provide the data in reasonable analysis ready format. But because we're accepting data that would be considered otherwise big data or real world data, we have to deal with other standardized data types. This is also built into the system. We can transform the data into a variety of formats so that we can provide both analysis data and data for regulatory submission. That's key to this whole project and what differentiates what we do at RDCA-DAP from other data stores.
Thank you, Jeff, for that very comprehensive answer. So now I have a question for both you and Michelle. How do you see real-world evidence evolving as a route to orphan drug approvals in the near future?
So I will start. So there is very high interest in the utilization of real-world evidence or real-world data in the drug regulatory space, and how can that be used in a way to help potentially support an approval or regulatory. I think we are still collaboratively together as this science is really emerging in the use of real-world data and real-world evidence of what that would look like and what do we actually need to be able to have it inform and help regulatory decision making. We do have some few examples, but I still think we're collaboratively working together, and efforts like RDCA-DAP helps us all collectively, all stakeholders, learn about what are the limitations, but also the capabilities of different sources of data, including real-world data. So I think that it's also an emerging field. I think we learn new things every day. But I think, again, this will probably take some additional time for us to make sure that the information we are receiving in from this data makes sense for a program and for what is that data supposed to be used for, and really defining a lot of those questions. There's a lot of questions that would be involved, and I think that's why working on things such as RDCA-DAP really helps us learn together, again, not only the limitations, but also what could be done with this data and how to use it in a way that is useful and informative to various stakeholders, including the FDA.
So I'll add to that as well. So again, I agree with Michelle that this is clearly a work in progress, but we're moving towards more and more of these real world evidence type trials getting done. Again, I think as we move to a value-based economy, you're seeing the payer community weigh in as a key stakeholder. And I think drug developers are paying attention to this. And it's simply a matter of reevaluating the data that's used for, say, a phase 3 approval and wondering and expecting that these products are going to continue to perform well on the marketplace. And there's the opportunity for real-world evidence to do additional investigations, sometimes with different endpoints that are more relevant to patients, and really show the clinical value and utility of these products. So I think you'll see more of them. I think the resource such as RDCA-DAP provides another source of information. Some of this data would be data that reflects the current standard of care. That's a big benefit of the platform. That accepts all data types. That could be registry data, completed clinical trials, natural history data, data from electronic medical records. So we are an equal opportunity data accumulator and provider of this information to the entire stakeholder community. I expect down the road that real world evidence will be part of that mix.
Excellent. So Michelle, another question for you. In what ways is the rare voice captured in clinical trial endpoints?
So obviously in all drug development for both our rare and our common diseases and disorders, we are fully encouraging of capturing of the patient voice to be able to support clinical trial endpoints. And we have put out and hosted 4 meetings to support a guidance methodological series actually on how to go from how do we capture the voice of the patient and capture patient experience data and really incorporate that into ways that can be used to support clinical trial endpoints. And so the agency has spent many years thinking about this and putting on public meetings and, again, some guidance documents. So we've had 2 guidances that are published as part of this methodological series. And those are really I would say are the foundation. They kind of build upon each other in the series. And the first one is about, talking to patients, talking to them and kind of putting on that scientific rigor of doing it in a way that the methodology is sound and what we're capturing is how to talk to patients and in that scientific way, capture and collect that information. And so that is our first guidance that is final and out. And the second guidance is still a draft guidance, but again, still informative of, so how do we take that information and kind of start to transition into more quantitative ways and what is it really meaning from the patient voice. And our final 2 guidances that we're waiting to come out will be, how do we really take what we hear from the patients and turn that into a clinical outcome assessment? So how do we make sure we're capturing in a rigorous way what's important to patients? And so I think our folks are very much familiar with patient-reported outcomes as one example. I think it's the one that's probably spoken about the most. But it's really all the clinical outcome assessments. So, this includes our observer-reported outcomes, which in our rare disease communities would be our caregivers or those who are taking care of the child the most or the patient the most. And then we have our clinician-reported outcomes. Again, these are outcomes that would come from a clinician, very important. And then our performance outcome measures. And in the rare disease space, where we are probably less likely to maybe use a patient-reported outcome due to disease or disorder. Not to say that it can't happen. There are definitely diseases and disorders that would be considered rare that we can. But we're often using what I would say are other tool baskets, our other type of outcome assessments a lot. And so the third guidance will really talk about those approaches. And then the fourth guidance, which is really important to those, because a lot of patient groups are trying to start exploring this of how to develop something because there may be potential things happening in the pipeline and they want to be ready when they are asked from companies on information, is that endpoint piece. And this fourth guidance, and we've had our public meetings on these. The discussion documents are still publicly available, as well as the meeting recordings. But it's translating, going from the data we capture to how do we translate that to an endpoint? Because the clinical outcome assessment is not necessarily the endpoint. And that it takes some real thinking about what are we trying to measure over what time, and the more that the analytical approaches to that, and really making sure that we are getting something that is clinically meaningful. So that is a way that the patient voice can be incorporated, and that is just one of those many ways that the patient voice can be incorporated. There's also the opportunity to submit patient experience data, which is a very broadly defined term and concept that can come in with a marketing application. And we recently published, I think it was this summer, our first report on the use of patient experience data in marketing applications. And what are we seeing? And I think to me, as someone who sits and looks and reviews things, is that we see more things than I think people actually realize that we do. We are seeing patient experience data in everything we do, because ultimately, the data we're capturing to support our endpoints are rooted in the patient and what's important to them.
Excellent. And so, sort of in a similar vein, I have a question for Anne and for you, Michelle. What are the steps to go through to set up a PFDD meeting, and who's responsible for planning and coordinating a PFDD meeting? So Anne, why don't
I can start a little bit, and then maybe Anne can chime in for her experience. Okay. So, there's many opportunities to have engagement with the agency. The two, I would say, the bigger ways that we see is through patient listening sessions that can happen from our Office of Patient Affairs or within a specific center. And those are much shorter in time than our patient-focused drug development meetings. But again, it is that opportunity for us to sit and listen and learn about a disease and disorder and that patient's lived experience. And then we have something a little bit larger, I would say, in my mind, is the progression is a patient-focused drug development meeting. And there are, I don't want to call them two types, but there are the ones that the FDA started at the beginning of PDUFA's 5. I'm trying to think my order of PDUFAs. And those were the first rounds of them. And I think we have now up to this date done close to 30 patient-focused drug development meetings ourselves. And most of them were in a rare disease or disorder. During that time, we recognized that the demand was definitely higher than what we could, really do in a manner that would allow for that rigor to happen. Is the externally led patient-focused drug development program emerged from this. And so that is what Anne's experience was. And so there is if you search FDA patient-focused drug development, you will come to the landing page of the patient-focused drug development program. And there are some areas that you can click on for more information. One includes the guidance series I was mentioning. But there is the one on externally led PFDD meetings, and this is also where you'll find all of the voice of the patient reports that have either come from our FDA meetings or these externally led meetings and have been submitted back to us. But it will include information on how to go through the externally led meeting process. So there is a process, a letter of intent, I think it is submitted and explains all that. And there is working with the agency for it, but it is a meeting that is led by a patient group. And I think Anne can probably talk about what that experience is like from that perspective.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. That was a great perspective on how to get involved. What we did at Krabbe Connect was partner with NORD, with National Organization of Rare Disorders. And we felt that was the best avenue for us to coordinate this type of meeting in order to have agendas, a framework, and able to get that voice of the patients, of the different experiences that we could get on the table, that NORD we partnered with NORD to really formulate that meeting and to organize it for us and to be the lead on it and get it off the ground. So our perspective was to work with them, which was an amazing committed, comprehensive, collaborative effort that we thoroughly enjoyed. And we know that our patient community benefited from it. And being able to have the voice of the patient report, the patient-focused drug development report, not only on NORD's website, but available through the FDA and also available to our Krabbe community, was an extremely useful tool. So.
Well, thank you for the shout out, Anne. And we are coming up on time, but I do have one more quick question. So I'll ask each of our panelists to answer quickly, although this is a huge question. What, in your opinion, is the single most effective action that patients and caregivers can do to affect positive change in the PFDD process? And I'll let you go first.
To share your story. For me, it was a very personal story to share, even though I am a patient advocate in the community, to share my story, to educate others, to create awareness. I represented a community and their voice, and it was powerful to be able to share that so that a change can be made for all of our patients affected by Krabbe.
I can just add, I'll just add, again, I would encourage the patients to show up and have a voice, to be heard, and to not feel that you can't weigh in on some of these critical decisions that every drug developer seeks to make. I think And I would encourage you to read the paper from Lilly because I think they've made a good outreach and it's good use cases that illustrate the early engagement. I mean, and I think we have to help pharmaceutical companies in this regard too. I think they have good intentions, but unless they hear this information early and often, they'll just trudge along and do the best that they can. But doing it without the patient voice is clearly not as good as doing it with.
Yeah, I would just add to both what Ann and Jeff has said. So have our patient groups share their stories and share their lived experience. And they're really, I think what we're hearing about are two different ways and to do that. So through patient-focused drug development, we're qualitatively hearing the patient voice. We're able to hear that through listening sessions, PFDD meetings, qualitative interviews, focus groups, for example. And we have ways to do that both through those examples, but also through methodological rigor through the PFDD guidance series. And the other way now, I think, is to think about, and what RDCA-DAP allows is having the quantitative side of the patient voice be able to be used. And that is a way that this effort is very unique, is because we are pulling so much data together that we're able to pull all the voices together for multiple data sets and data sources. We know that one data source alone, and I think the video did a great job of explaining that, really, it tells us one small piece. And the efforts that the Critical Path Institute and NORD have done is really how do we pull all of the types of data together and really take the quantitative aspect of the patient voice to help inform drug development. And so I think this really highlights two different avenues of how to do that, successfully how to do that, and how we need all of these type of things because we all are individual stakeholders, individually and collectively together in advancing of rare disease drug development. And so I think I would encourage patient groups and those who may have data to think about wanting to contribute their data. And in time, can be used to help answer some of those questions that we have, such as simply as the natural history of a disease. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges we face every day when we're talking about rare disease drug development. So I would say tell your story, and your story can be told in a couple different ways now. And I'm really glad to know that we have these multiple pathways for that to happen.
Well, thank you all so much. You've all had some really wonderful insights to share with our viewers. I've also noticed that we've gotten a lot of questions in the chat about the RDCA-DAP, how it works, and how to get involved. I'm so excited that so many of our viewers are interested in contributing data in the RDCA-DAP and in learning more about it. So we will circulate information about the RDCA-DAP in our post-webinar messaging. And we hope to speak with many of you about the RDCA-DAP in more detail one-on-one. So I'd like to remind you once again that we will be sending out a recording of this webinar to everyone who registered for the event. You're more than welcome to share the recording with anyone who you think might find it helpful. And I'd love to take a moment to thank our panelists, Mr. Gary, Dr. Campbell, and Dr. Barrett for joining us for this discussion today, as well as our viewers for joining us this afternoon and for asking such insightful and thought-provoking questions. We appreciate our panelists' time and we appreciate our viewers' time as well. Thank you all, and be on the lookout for a follow-up message from us. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.